on each side. And one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is when you lay out a polygon, you want all of the sides to be equal. So the pentagon is a prime example. A regular polygon is a polygon that has all the outside sides equal and all the interior angles equal. And we're talking about a regular polygon. Polygons can be any shape that are closed, but regular polygons are enclosed with all sides and angles equal. They come by the numbers anywhere from 3 to 11 in this case. They go higher than that, but you see once you get past 9 or 10, they start looking like circles. And really a circle is nothing more than a polygon with infinite sides. I first got introduced to polygons in wood turning through AAW, and in their December 2005 magazine, a gentleman started turning polygon boxes, and we thought that had been a great idea, so that's kind of where we started looking at turning polygon bowls and other shapes. Also, in an issue last year, in August of 2018, they came out with, Beth Ireland came out making pencils. And a pencil is a polygon with 6 sides. And so that's twice now in a year we've seen some polygons in wood turning. So how do you lay out a polygon? You can do it with a compass. You can do it with a protractor. A compass is easy if you're doing a 6-sided polygon because the radius is the same length as the side. But when you look at 5 and particularly 7, you can't lay out a 7-sided polygon with a compass. You can do it with a protractor, but you got to be very, very accurate. The article in the AAW magazine, the gentleman laid out his polygons with a protractor, and you can do it. He did a 7-side that way, but it's very hard to be accurate when you lay it out that way. So, how many people like their 10th grade or 9th grade algebra and geometry classes? We're going to talk a little bit about math tonight because polygons are really a math item. So on a 5-sided polygon, you have a radius of r, you have a side length a, and side length a is equal to 2r, or 2 times the radius, times the sine of 180 degrees over n, and n is the number of sides of the polygon. So in this case, you can see where you would have 180 divided by 5 in this case to determine the length of the sides of the polygon. Here's an example of a 7-sided polygon that has a radius of 3.75 inches. So the length of the side that we're going to play with tonight is side A, and that length is determined by 2r times the sine of 180 over 7. Well, 182r is equal to the diameter as well of that circle, and it ends up being 7.5 inches. If you divide 180 by 7, you get 25.714, and the sine of 25.714 is 0.434. So if you take the radius or the diameter of 7.5 and you multiply it times 0.434, you end up getting the length of the side of the polygon, which in this case is 3.255. And so that's, you can now take that math and use it for any size polygon just by making the adjustment of 180 over n, where the n would be the side, number of sides of the polygon. So to try and make it a little bit easier, so you don't have to do the math, I put this chart together where if you look down, you'll find under size, number of sides 7, you'll see the same 25.7 degrees. And the sign of that is 0.434. So if we go back and look at, you'll see the 25.714 in degrees, and on this chart I've rounded it up to 25.7. But the 0.434 still gives you the length of the side times the diameter of the polygon. So what other methods are there for laying out a polygon? Well, as I talked earlier, you can use a protractor. My friend John Beasley from the Denton Club used a polygraph paper, polargraph paper, excuse me, and laid it out for 5 and 7 sides. And it worked really well, except he made them pretty small, and it's hard to magnify that up. I approached my friend Neil Brand, who's a PhD in mathematics at the University of North Texas, and said, is there a way we could come up with a jig to lay out polygons? And he said, well, I don't know, let's think about it. So he went and talked to his son-in-law, who has a 3D printer, and he came up with this template. And if you look close, there's 6 different holes, 6 different circles on that template. And each circle represents the number of sides of a polygon. So in this case, if you wanted a 5-sided polygon, you would start with the inner circle. And if you wanted a 10-sided polygon, you could start with the outer circle. So we'll show how you can lay out using that template as well. And Neil's son-in-law made a bunch of them. We've got them up here. Neil's selling them. If anybody wants one of those templates, afterwards you're welcome to pick one up. I think, Neil, they're what, $10? So we'll talk about laying one out using that method as well. Here you can see I've put it on a block of wood. I've done the same thing here, so we'll lay that out in a minute. And you can see how you make the marks on your block. You draw the lines from the center through that mark, and that'll give you the length of each side. And then you draw the lines between those where those cut through the circle, and you take it to a bandsaw and cut them out, and you end up with getting a polygon without doing any of the math. And by the way, if anybody has any questions while we're going through this, yell them out at me. I'm a little hard of hearing, but let's keep this informal. So if you want a question. So let's lay out a polygon, and let's do it the mathematical way. I've got a block of wood here that we're just going to draw a circle on it. Then I'm going to measure the diameter of that circle, and it ends up being, and I do everything in metric because it's a whole lot easier than trying to measure this as 8.8 and 9/16. Now how do I have to convert the 9/16? So I'll use the metric version, and I find that I've got 21.9 centimeters. So if I take 21.9 centimeters and I multiply, we're going to lay this out as a 7-side. So if I take 180 divided by 7, I end up getting 0.434 from that chart we looked at earlier. So I take that times 0.434, and I end up with a side that's 9.50 centimeters in length. So that would be from this point to this point would be 9.5 centimeters. So if I take a divider and I set this to 9.5, and then I start laying it out, and I'll just kind of poke a hole here, and I'll just work my way around. And then I'll start at the top again and work the other dimensions the other way. And you see I'm right on the mark on this side. So now I have the marks on there. I just take a ruler between those marks and lay it out, and it ends up looking like this, where you can see I've divided each one equally, and then all I do now is I take it to the bandsaw, and I cut these right on. I cut them actually a little bit short of the line, so when I sand them, they'll be right on the line, and then you end up with a piece that looks like that. At this point, because you end up with a rough turned device, I always want to sand it before I do anything else. So I put a sanding disc on the lathe, and then I'm not going to do it tonight. And then I sand each side until I get it as smooth as I can get it. Because once you get it turned, it's very difficult to sand this again and get all the saw cuts from the saw on it. So I'm going to, Neil, why don't you pass this one around? This is still rough. It's got all the saw cuts on it. Here's a one I laid out with 9 sides. And if you look, I'm going to pass this around. If you look at the second row down from the outside, and you can easily move this a little bit. It's not on there real tight. You'll see that the second hole down lines up with the corners, so that on a 9-sided polygon you can see how well it works out. Any questions about that? Let's turn one. Let's have some fun. Well, before we do, let me go back to this one again. If you want to see how to lay this one out, let's lay out a 7. I'm just going to hold it in place, and I'm going to go up to the third line around and just put a pencil mark. And you can't see the lines. I'm using rough wood on this, so it's a little difficult to. Let me make sure I get enough lead out and just try this again. There we go. Okay, those lines we can see. And I'm just going to draw one of them out. And if you did that for each of these, you can see you get the 7 sides, and then you just draw your lines from the outside circle, and then cut it on a bandsaw. So this is one I've laid out. I've sanded. I've put a hole in it in the center. I'm going to mount it on a screw chuck. This thing must be on high speed because there's no torque at low end. So since this is rough wood, the first thing I'm going to do is just clean this side up a little bit because I've got to put a tenon over here. So just take a bowl gouge. So here's the center. I'm going to use a mortise instead of a tenon. So I'm going to go in here. I set this chart for the mortise on my chuck. And so that's it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a center point in the middle. So when I reverse chuck it, I know where the center is. And then I'm going to put a mortise in here. And I want that to be really clean because when I turn it around, if I end up getting a lot of wobble in it, then these corners will not be the same length every time. So it's important that tenon, or in this case the mortise, is really, really clean. And I'm just using an really old parting tool that I have. I've cut an angle on it so that it matches the dovetail of my jaws of my chuck. And so now I want a foot on this. And if I look at, roughly a third and a third, I'm going to come out about there. I'm close. So now I'm going to start taking this side down. And I want a nice gentle curve on it as I do that. So there's my foot. So you can hear once I get outside, I'm cutting air and wood. And I want to make that foot a little bit bigger. And I tend to use, when I make a foot on the bottom of a bowl, I tend to make it round rather than a square corner, because it's so much easier to sand a rounded corner than it is a square corner and get it nice and uniform. I'm using a pull cut because I want to just get rid of a lot of wood. When I want a nice finished cut, I'll use a push cut on the end. So I could do it either way. I can come in here, but trying to just eliminate a lot of wood, I find it easier to just use a pull cut. So I've got it down about 45 degrees, and I've got this tool into my hip, and I'm just and at this point I'm close to what I wanted, so now I'll try a push cut. We'll stop and take a look at it. And I have a fairly good cut. I'm not real pleased with it, but it's not too bad. I'd like my foot to be a little bit deeper, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to make one more pass at that. Now, if you have trouble doing a push cut, it's often hard to control because you're starting off to the side, and you got to continually move your arm with it. One of the things I learned several years ago from Al Sturt was to use a shear cut. Now, a lot of people will use a shear cut by dropping the handle way down, closing the flute so it's almost closed, and running that across the surface, and it gives you a pretty nice cut. You can also do the same thing with a scraper. And this is one of the things I learned from Al Sturt, is that put the scraper at about 45 degrees and run it across. And you get these beautifully fine shavings coming off. So it's not a scrape, it's actually a cut. And you end up with a really nice surface. And I've got pretty much the shape I want. There's a little bump in there. We're going to try and get that out. Got to be real careful about knocking the corners off. It's not as bad on if you go to an 8 or 9 sided polygon because you don't have near as much air that you're chasing. But when you get to that point, you got to cut very carefully so you don't knock the corners off. And at this point, I would now sand this to about 600, at least 400, and then I would put a finish on it. I'd start by putting a sanding sealer on this side. Once I turn it around, it's hard to get back to working on this side again. So at this point, I'd sand this down. I don't want to spend time sanding tonight. I just use a power sander, and I would start at probably 220, 180 or 220. This is ash. Yeah, the kind of wood I'm using tonight is ash. I like turning ash. I'm sorry? It has a nice figure. Yeah, it's got a lot of nice grain to it and a lot of nice figure. So sanding, I'd sand at low speed and I'd come in here and you got to be careful when you get to the points so you don't want to round them off. But with a rounded foot, it's much easier to sand into that foot rather than trying to sand into a square corner. So, don't want to create a lot of dust tonight, so we're gonna leave it at that. And then we're gonna turn around. And you can see I've got a fairly nice shape going into this. I could have worked a little better right at the foot. There's a little ding there, but it's not bad. I'm using a chuck with dovetail jaws. And I want those jaws fairly close to being closed. I get the best surface when the jaws are real close to being closed because that's the way they make the jaws. They make them in a round form and then they cut them with a saw so that as close as you can get to being closed will give you the best surface. And then I want to make sure that that's running true, and I don't see any wobble on this at all. So I got a good mortise on the back side. And with the dovetail jaws, you don't need to crank this down so hard that you crack out the wood. I've got enough force in there that it's going to hold really well. I'm not worried about it coming loose at all. So again, I want to clean up this surface. And before I do too much, I want to start shaping this side now to try and match the curvature on the back side. So that my goal now will just be to come in here and I've started, but I'm not close to matching that surface yet, so I'm going to take this down at least another 1/8 of an inch. But you can see the size of these squares now are almost exactly the same. That tells me I've got a good, it's chucked the way I want it to hold it nice and square. Just a little bit more. And I think those curves are real close to being the same, so I'm going to go with that. And I like putting some decorations on the bowl. I think this one's a little narrow. I'm going to make it a little bit wider than this. So I'm going to come in here. Probably about there. We'll start there and see how that looks. Always tends to jump right at that hole in the center, so I like taking that out and get this line out of here. I like to stop and see. I've got a lot of wood left down in there. I like leaving a little wood in the center. It kind of gives me an idea how deep I'm going. And so it also adds a little support. Still pretty thick down here. I'm going to take a couple more cuts. Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, I'm going to, on my bowl gouges, I always take the heel off because when you're trying to make this corner, that sharp edge on your heel will indent your wood. And I've got a little of that even though I've taken the heel off. So I'm going to go and make one cut with a smaller bowl gouge to try and clean some of that up. I'm going to start all the way out. Yes, tool rest is a little low. I like that cut. It's pretty clean. I could actually go maybe another cut deeper, but it's pretty good. On these bowls, I like to have a little weight to them. With ash, you have a real open grain wood, so you end up with some of the grain being rather soft and some of the grain being rather hard. So a lot of times you'll get some chatter in here, particularly when you sand. If you sand very aggressively, you'll end up getting a lot of ripples in the bottom because of the hard softness of the open grain. I've got a little bit of that. One of the nice ways of taking that out, if you can't make a cut with a gouge, is using a negative rake scraper. And I'll show you how that works. It actually cuts very nicely on ash and leaves a really nice fine surface. And you see the shavings that came off. They're just really nice and fine. I like that. I like that surface. I think it's very sandable at this point. I'm not going to do any more to it. I've got a little bit of rough spot here yet on the outside, and I'm going to go back to my shear scraper on that. I'm going to use a little different one this time. And you see the shavings that come off of that are really nice and fine too. I'm sorry? No, this is not a negative rake. This is just a plain scraper with a slight radius cut on it. And I use it mostly from center down. And I put a really good burr on it to start with. Still got one little spot there. You see the shavings that are coming off? That's not a typical scrape. That's a shear cut. That's good. I'm going to put some beads on it. I have a small beading tool, and I'm going to put 3 beads on. I'm going to start with one right in the center. Yeah, it's not quite the center. So we'll go just a little left of that. I'm going to put one on either side of that. Now, some people like to make those proud, so you could go back in here now and you could cut this down a little bit and cut the inside down a little bit. I don't want to do that because I got these sides just about where I want them to be on this. So if I cut that down, I think these sides will get a little bit too narrow. So I'm going to leave it like that. And so now it's a matter of sanding. Sand the sides. I'll sand the sides, and when I do, it usually flattens these beads. So I'll go back and recut them after sanding because I don't want them flat. I want the nice round look. I would now spend some time sanding the top or the sides, and all I do there is I take a 320 or 400 grit piece of paper on a block, and I'd lock the spindle and just very lightly sand these to keep them nice and flat, and just take out any tool marks that are left on them. Any questions so far? Because now we're going to turn it around and take the bottom off. How many use vacuum chucks? Not very many. We're going to use a vacuum chuck tonight. It's my favorite way of taking the bottom off. This chuck is nothing more than a piece of PVC coupling where I've flattened the surface and I've glued a piece of funky foam onto it, and I just use CA glue to just put that on with, And when it gets all chewed up, I just cut it off and I'll put another piece on and keep doing it till this PVC goes away.
What kind of foam is that?
I'm sorry?
What kind of foam is that?
I call this funky foam. I get it at Michael's. It's foam that the kids used to make stuff out of. You can use any kind of foam. I prefer foam that's not real thick, but it doesn't matter. It's so easy to change and take off and put a new piece on that. Yes. Yeah, closed cell foam is fine. Piece of leather works good. You know, if you got a piece of leather that's fairly thick. Well, I don't think it'll leak when you put 18 to 20 pounds of vacuum on it. I don't think whether it's open or closed cell foam is going to make any difference, Dan. I've got a live center here someplace, and I don't know where it is. So we'll use this one. Now the reason I put that dimple on the bottom is that I want to be able to find this center point. And that's, I'm not getting much of a wobble on that at all, so I'm going to go with that. I've got 20 inches of mercury holding that on, so I'm going to take that off. And I'm going to use a small spindle gouge. And take the center out. Now, my goal when I do the bottoms of these is I want to make it so you can't tell how I chucked it. So I'm going to take this, I'll make sure I got a nice flat bottom. Does it grab? Never. I've never had that grab at all. No. And all I'm concerned about here is that I have a nice flat bottom, and I do. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to take some of this out now. And I'm going to use a negative rake scraper that's got a smaller radius on it. And I'm just going to go in here on the bottom and clean that up. Take any grooves out. Then I'm going to go back to my beading tool. I always like to decorate the bottom. And so again, I would now sand this, make sure this is still sanded and finished the way I like it. And I put a coat of sanding seal on it and then finish it to however you'd like to finish it. And that's a Polygon bowl. Any questions? Thank you.
Did you learn your techniques first and then learn how to do the polygons or what?
Yeah, I just started doing these polygons